Chapter 9. Crash. It wasn't a complete recollection, mostly just large, disconnected chunks. But it was enough. The mob outside the gates was so loud. She'd hurried fast as possible to class, but it was impossible not to flinch at the sight of the parading Reserve Corps students, their voices thick with hate, and the way their yells grew louder and angrier when they saw her. She couldn't help thinking,
what if Hinata-kun's among them?
The thought of him being among that jeering crowd, violent and furious and in danger from security, frightened her, and she worried at her lip. She snapped open her umbrella and followed Kameda-kun outside. While she was glad he was back, fear for Sumiki-san wormed in her stomach.
This was such a terrible time for Sumiki-san to get lost.
What if some of the parading students assaulted her? The nurse's self-esteem was so fragile, she probably wouldn't fight back at all. She hoped that Kameda-kun's luck would ensure they found her before anything too bad happened. Her skin was distinctly crawling, like when she was playing a horror game late at night. How had Mitarai-kun gotten down there ahead of them? Why was he so thin? Why were his face gray and body shaking? Who was this woman with him? Her eyes, her bearing, everything about her gave off the vibe of an antagonist. These questions battled for dominance in her mind, and she fought the urge to run away. Mitarai-kun looked like he was in trouble, and it was her duty as class rep, as his friend, to help him.
Killing is wrong, no matter what,
she protested. She barely understood what Kameda-kun was talking about, this huge speech on hope and despair, but she did know that one law was universal. Whatever this girl had done, she surely didn't deserve to die for it.
How had Kameda-kun even snuck a gun past all the security anyway? Was she really about to witness an attempted murder? This was supposed to be a normal day. Things had escalated so fast. His eyes suddenly widened, and he wheeled, pointing the gun at something over her shoulder. She turned to see why, catching the sight of a young man with very long, dark hair. Something about him seemed familiar, but before she could study him closely, he disappeared. There was a gunshot, and she saw Kameda-kun fall. She almost screamed, rushing to catch him. She patted him down, looking for blood. Oh, thank God, there'd been a handbook in his breast pocket. He wasn't dead. And when she looked up, time stood still. Everything fell away. The room, Enoshima-san, Mitarai-kun, even Kameda-kun's injured body. None of it mattered in that moment as she stared up and up into red eyes that should have been green. It was dark and his hair was hiding most of his face. But she knew. Spellbound, she peered into those eyes, searching for Hinata-kun, because it was definitely him. But she had to ask, had to make sure. Her heart was a jumbled knot of emotions. Happiness at finally finding Hinata-kun. Curiosity as to why he looked so different. Anxiety about the blank look in his eyes. And then pain at his cruelly indifferent, "Who are you?" And then there was worry about Kameda-kun, worry about Yukizome-sensei, and a thick, heavy fear overlying it all. Her feet pushed her and Kameda-kun to the academy building ahead, but her thoughts were with those behind. She smiled as her classmates rallied their ascent, a wave of relief washing over her. It had taken more self-control than she thought she owned to not let her friends be privy to the fearful thoughts in her head. Because Yukizome-sensei had tripped a mentor death flag, staying behind as she had, and she couldn't let her die. Not after everything she'd done for them. Alone, she was powerless. She was just that bullied gamer. But with her friends, with all their talents in tandem, she could surely succeed.
Sumiki-san, Yukizome-sensei, why?
There was pain in her arm from where she'd landed on it wrong, but it seemed inconsequential compared to the pain in her heart. Her throat was too clogged by betrayal to speak. All she could do was stare up at the rapidly shrinking image of her teacher as the elevator carted her off into darkness. Memories of Sumiki-san's apologetic face, the crazed look in Yukizome-sensei's eyes floated before her. She didn't understand why they'd done this, and she could only ask their phantoms, uncomprehending.
Why?
Her heartbeat was echoing loudly in her ears, and she almost couldn't stand, her legs weakened by terror. A cold, stone hallway spread out before her. Monitors glowed brightly in the shadows. On them, a face with ice-blue eyes and a smile with too many teeth. Her eyes took all this in with disbelief, because this just couldn't be happening, as Enoshima-san's cheerful voice proclaimed, "As the curtain raiser for our wonderful despair,
it's punishment time!"
She couldn't figure out the puzzle to this awful maze, the secret route that would get her out safely. Her heart drummed like a jackhammer as she tried to navigate her way out. A mindless litany of thoughts ran through her head, over and over.
So dark. Everything's gone wrong. I'm so scared. What's wrong with Hinata-kun? What's wrong with Yuki-san? What's wrong with Yukisomi-sensei? I'm so scared. Where are my friends? They won't leave me. Where are they? Danger, dodge, pain. God, it hurts. I'm so scared.
Euphoric relief crashed into her as her blurry vision saw the door, the golden goal printed on it. Everything hurt. It all hurt so much, but she was so close, so close. She pushed through the pain, a bloody hand grasping the doorknob. The door creaked open slowly, and she envisioned her smiling friends and teacher on the other side. All she could think was,
I made it. I'm safe. I'm safe.
And then everything cut off. But it wasn't hard to figure out what had happened. Of course the door would be trapped. What better way to push people into despair than offer it on the heels of hope? Looking again at the scars on her body, Chiaki figured that whatever trap had been on the door was behind the marks on her abdomen. They were the only ones she didn't remember getting, and the one on her chest was so close to her heart, so obviously intended to be fatal. It was a miracle Kamakura-kun had been able to save her at all. The entire ordeal was an awful thing to remember, and she trembled. After all, no one wanted to recall being forced into a game of cat and mouse, where they were harassed and harried and slowly tortured to death. But amidst those puzzle pieces, one memory, one line, stood out as more terrible than everything else. When you die, this video will throw all your classmates into despair.
It was my idea.
Chiaki thought, almost choking on guilt and horror now.
It was my idea to go there. It was my idea to try and fight Enoshima ourselves instead of getting help. And she predicted it. And she used it to brainwash them.
She screamed. There weren't any words in it. It was purely animal, a howl of pain and despair.
It was my idea. It was my idea that put my friends in her claws. It was my idea that doomed them. It was my idea.
She'd run her party into the final dungeon thinking they were ready to beat the boss, only to find they'd been horribly underleveled.
You stupid, stupid girl.
her inner voice berated.
Did you really think you could play the hero? Save the mentor, save the love interest, save the day, and everyone goes home jolly as could be. Someone like you could never have succeeded. You should have left it to the experts, but you didn't, and now look what came of it.
She couldn't breathe. Her chest was heaving, trying to suck in air, but her lungs just weren't working. The scars on her body suddenly seemed as burning brands. She wasn't vain, she'd never been bothered by them much, but she had viewed them with a certain pride, as a testimony to her survival. Now they were just reminders of every single mistake she'd made that day, hot and shameful against her skin. A voice was calling her name, a familiar voice. But it was distant. Her room was dark and her vision was blurred by tears, but she could vaguely see a solid black form with 2 red pinpricks of light leaning over her. A small part of her brain recognized it, but the overwhelming hysteria and despair drowned that part out. To her, it seemed some kind of shadowy monster come to finish the job Enoshima started. She screamed again and lashed out. Hands caught hers and easily pinned them to the bed. She struggled, trying to get away, but the grip was iron. The hold shifted, her wrists were moved to a single hand, then something metallic and cold stabbed her arm, and Chiaki felt her limbs grow heavy. Everything seemed to be fading away.